Hello there. In this video, I'm going to be analyzing a certain sort of argument for veganism that I call an arbitrariness argument, and I'm going to argue that it succeeds in justifying its conclusion once we revise it a couple of times to account for some objections. Now, this sort of argument is relatively common, especially when it comes to the topic of veganism, but the specific version that I'll be analyzing is heavily inspired by an argument in a paper by philosopher Alastair Norcross and a discussion of that argument in a book chapter by philosopher Daniel Korman. I've put info about these references in the description below, and I highly recommend that you check them out. I should also say that it's not clear to me whether either of these philosophers would endorse my version of the argument. Now, veganism is not quite at the forefront of the culture wars. Perhaps it just has too few proponents at the moment, but it is something that is occasionally discussed, and it is something that deals with philosophical issues that are relevant to other contemporary culture war issues. For instance, questions like what sort of things deserve moral consideration and how much moral consideration do they deserve. Those questions are relevant to other issues such as abortion. So even if you're not interested in veganism itself, you may still get something out of thinking about it carefully. So before I get to the actual argument, I'm just going to discuss what I'm calling arbitrariness arguments in general. So here's the structure of an arbitrariness argument. This one is an argument for the wrongness of y, where y is some type of action. Premise 1, if it's wrong to x, then it's wrong to y. Premise 2, it's wrong to x. Conclusion, so it's wrong to y. So any argument of this form is going to be valid, right? The premises are going to entail the conclusion. So the question is, when evaluating an argument like this, should we accept these premises? And when you're constructing an arbitrariness argument, the goal in choosing an x is to make sure that both premises come out plausible, right? So to make this first premise plausible, you're going to want to choose an x that's similar to y in morally relevant respects, such that if x is really wrong, the reasons for which it would be wrong would also have to make y wrong, right? So you're going to want it to be to seem sort of arbitrary to deny this first premise, to say that x is wrong but y isn't. And obviously in choosing an x, you want to make sure the second premise is plausible. So you're going to want to choose something that is really intuitively wrong, that most people will find wrong, and that, it's going to be difficult to deny that it's wrong. Now, the benefit of an arbitrariness argument like this is that there might be some issue whose morality is either controversial or perhaps you're undecided on it, right? This would be the morality of y. And the goal is to learn something about that by this other case, x, which is either less controversial or maybe you feel more decided on, right? So insofar as we find it plausible that x is wrong, we're going to be moved to find it plausible that y is also wrong, assuming the first premise is true. Now, this is not the only possible structure of an arbitrariness argument. Here's another possible structure, this time against the wrongness of y. So this is an argument for the conclusion that y is not wrong. Premise 1 prime, if it's wrong to y, then it's wrong to x. Premise 2 prime, it's not wrong to x. Conclusion, so it's not wrong to y, right? So in choosing an x, again in this case, you want to make sure that both premises are plausible. You want to make sure that it's something that's similar to y in morally relevant respects, such that if y were to be wrong, the reasons for which it would be wrong would also have to make x wrong. And then obviously you want to choose an x that's intuitively not wrong, that most people are going to find to not be wrong. Alright, so in some future videos, I might consider some more arbitrariness arguments, perhaps dealing with abortion, but in this video we're going to be considering an argument with this first form. Now, I did say that it's an argument for veganism, which, if we interpret that as a moral claim, perhaps it's something like it's wrong to purchase or consume animal products. But really, the argument's going to argue for a more restricted form, a more restricted claim, namely that it's wrong to purchase factory-farmed animal products. So that's not quite full-blown veganism, but it is in that direction. All right. So here's the first version of the argument. We're obviously going to have to revise it a couple of times. Premise 1, if it's wrong to torture puppies for enjoyment, then it's wrong to purchase factory-farmed animal products. Premise 2, it's wrong to torture puppies for enjoyment. Conclusion, so it's wrong to purchase factory-farmed animal products. Okay, now the second premise is quite plausible, at least for me, and I expect it's going to be plausible for most of you, right? Insofar as you find anything to be wrong, torturing puppies for enjoyment seems like a pretty damn good candidate for something that's wrong. So I think it's difficult to deny, and even if you are the sort of person who might deny it or not find it plausible, you're probably not going to advertise this fact, to your friends or family. They might stop inviting you to parties, especially if there are dogs running around. But like I said, I expect most people to find this plausible. So the question is, should we accept this first premise, right? Now, if you're a proponent of this argument, in order to justify a premise like this, you're going to want to claim that, look, here are the ways in which the two actions are similar, and furthermore, these are the morally relevant factors, and there's no differences that are morally relevant. Now, if you're an opponent of the argument, if you're trying to resist this first premise, the goal is to try to find some way in which the two actions are different, and then argue that this is morally relevant. Okay? So we're going to consider an objection, and I think this is the first objection that would naturally come up when presented with an argument like this. And it goes something like this. The former, right, is for pleasure, whereas the latter may be for survival or health. The latter is necessary. You don't need to torture puppies for enjoyment, but you do need to eat, right? Okay, so the response that I'm going to make to this objection is the following. You don't need to purchase factory-farmed animal products for a healthy, affordable diet. And I'm going to call this empirical assumption V. Okay? Now, this is an empirical assumption. It's something that, to justify it, you would need to go into the world and investigate. Presumably, you'd want to check with the qualified medical or nutritional institutions to see what they say on the matter. It's not something we can just settle purely by armchair reasoning. So what I'm going to do is just make this assumption for the purpose of this video. Okay? I'm going to be granting empirical assumption V. Now, if you're a skeptic of this claim, or if you think it's false, it still may be worth looking at the implications of it if it is true. In other words, analyzing an argument that assumes it's true. And that's for a couple of reasons. First, you could be mistaken, right? You could think it's false, but it might actually be true. Second, even if it's not true at the moment, there may come a time in which it's true, and so it might be worth seeing the moral implications of it when that time comes. In other words, the argument, given this assumption, might fail at the moment, but a very similar argument might succeed in the future once this assumption does become true. And furthermore, this assumption might be true in some cases, but not in others. In other words, for some people, it might be true that they don't need to purchase factory-farmed animal products for a healthy, affordable diet, but for other people, it's not true. In other words, they do need to purchase factory-farmed animal products for either a healthy or affordable diet. And so, if this assumption is false for you, perhaps the argument doesn't apply to you. In other words, it doesn't entail that it's wrong for you to purchase factory-farmed animal products. But if you're in the other position, if you are the sort of person for whom this empirical assumption is true, that is to say you don't need to purchase factory-farmed animal products for a healthy or affordable diet, then you can consider this argument targeted towards you, okay? What it's wrong for you to do. Okay, so like I said, we're just going to make this assumption for the purpose of this video. Now, how does this help with the objection? Well, the objection said that, torturing puppies for enjoyment is for pleasure, whereas purchasing factory farmed animal products is necessary for survival or health, and the response is to deny that claim. It's not necessary for survival or health. You don't need to purchase factory farmed animal products. You do need to eat, but you don't need to eat that, right? So you're purchasing factory farmed animal products so that you can eat certain foods that give you pleasure or that you enjoy, but you're not doing it to survive, or at least you don't need to do it to survive. Okay, so let's consider another objection. Now, this next objection, I don't think many people will find very compelling, even if you are an opponent of this argument. But we might as well get it out the way and revise our argument to get around it. So it goes something like this. The former involves you doing it, whereas the latter involves you paying someone else to do it. Okay? So you're the one torturing puppies for enjoyment, whereas you're merely paying other people who are the ones who are inflicting the suffering on animals in factory farms. Now, like I said, I don't expect many people to find this compelling, right? Most of us would say that whether it's you who pull the trigger to kill someone, or whether you instead pay a hitman who pulls the trigger, those two actions are morally on par. So you might think this doesn't make much of a moral difference. However, we might as well just revise the argument to get around this. So here is the second version of the argument, argument B. If it's wrong to purchase puppy torture videos for enjoyment, then it's wrong to purchase factory farmed animal products. It's wrong to purchase puppy torture videos for enjoyment, so it's wrong to purchase factory farmed animal products. Now we've revised the argument, we've tweaked it in a certain way, but I still expect the second premise to be plausible for most people. Okay? If you're on board for the second premise in the original version, I don't expect to have lost you with this second premise. And now the first premise avoids the previous objection. Now, in both cases, you're paying someone else. You're not the one directly inflicting the suffering. Here's another objection. I think this objection is a lot more compelling than the previous one. Okay? The former involves intentionally taking pleasure in the suffering of animals, whereas in the latter, the animal suffering is an unfortunate byproduct of producing tasty food, right? So when you're torturing puppies for enjoyment, you're taking pleasure in, puppy suffering, but when you purchase factory farmed animal products, you're not taking pleasure in the suffering of the animals that were harmed to procure it. You're taking pleasure in something else, okay? So some of you might find this to be morally relevant, some of you might not, but let's just revise the argument to get around it. So here's the third version, argument C. Premise 1, if it's wrong to purchase puppy fight videos for enjoyment, then it's wrong to purchase factory farmed animal products. It's wrong to purchase puppy fight videos for enjoyment, so it's wrong to purchase factory farmed animal products. Okay, so we've switched it from puppy torture videos to puppy fight videos, okay? And again, I expect everyone to still be on board with this second premise, if you are already on board. Now, the first premise avoids this previous objection, because you're not taking pleasure in the animal suffering itself. What you're taking pleasure in is the sport of puppy fights, which inevitably is going to involve some animal suffering, but your pleasure is not in the suffering itself. It's in, the thrill of the fight, the sport, something like that. So I think it's a pretty subtle difference, but it is something that someone might claim is morally relevant, okay? But I think there's a similar objection that will apply to this argument, okay? And it goes like this. The former still involves intentionally taking pleasure in animal violence, whereas the latter just involves taking pleasure in eating certain foods, which unfortunately requires some animal cruelty to procure, okay? So when you purchase the puppy fight videos, you're not taking pleasure in the animal suffering per se, or the suffering itself. You're taking pleasure in, but you are taking pleasure in animal violence, right? Whereas when you purchase factory farmed animal products, you're taking pleasure in the taste of certain foods, but not at all in animal violence. That's not what you're taking pleasure in, even though it was involved, right? Okay, again, This might strike some of you as morally relevant. It might strike others as irrelevant. But let's just revise the argument once more to get around this sort of objection. Brings us to argument D. Premise 1. If it's wrong to purchase puppy body parts, which requires some cruelty to procure for a home art gallery, then it's wrong to purchase factory farmed animal products. It's wrong to purchase puppy body parts, which requires some cruelty to procure for a home art gallery. Therefore, it's wrong to purchase factory farmed animal products. So you can fill in the details of the case however you'd like, right? Perhaps you need, the skins of puppies for this art, and you can only get them by skinning them alive. You can fill in the gruesome details however you'd like to make the case have this feature, right? Now, even though we've switched from first puppy torture videos and then puppy fight videos now to essentially art supplies made of puppy body parts, I still expect many people, if not most people, to be on board with this second premise. I expect most people to find this to be wrong. Okay, now the first premise avoids the previous objection. Now we're not taking pleasure in animal violence or cruelty at all, okay? What we're taking pleasure in is appreciating a certain sort of art, which unfortunately requires some animal cruelty, some puppy cruelty to procure, right? Just like how when you purchase factory farmed animal products, you're not intentionally taking pleasure in animal suffering or violence. You're taking pleasure in certain tastes, which unfortunately require some animal cruelty to procure. So I think they're now similar in those respects that led to the previous objections. But I think we're still open to some other objections. So here's another objection. And this objection I expect you to be roughly split on, right? Some of you might find it to be relevant. Some of you might not. But it's certainly worth getting on the table, okay? The former involves dogs, whereas the latter involves cows, pigs, and chickens, okay? Now, this objection's not going to be that plausible if we just leave it there. Presumably, we're going to want to say something about, what it is about dogs versus cows, pigs, and chickens that could explain this moral difference. That could explain why it's wrong to, treat puppies in this way, but perhaps not wrong to treat cows, pigs, and chickens in this way. So here are some candidate answers, and I'll talk about these after I get them on the table. We raise dogs as companions. Maybe we feel closer to them. And perhaps dogs are more intelligent, emotional, self-aware, sensitive, etc. All right, I'm going to say a little bit about each of these things. First, we raise dogs as companions. Okay. Now, if you think this makes a moral difference, what that seems to show is that, for you at least, the wrongness of treating puppies in this way is not really anything about the puppies in themselves or what we owe to dogs, but it's more about what we owe to other humans or humanity as a whole. It's a function of what our human goals and interests are regarding puppies. And I'll just say that I don't find that particularly plausible. I find it to be much more plausible that if it's wrong to, treat puppies in this way, it has something to do with puppies in themselves as opposed to our goals regarding puppies. Also, you might ask yourselves, if we entirely changed our goals regarding certain animals, does that automatically change the morality of treating them in certain ways, right? If we just collectively decided to start to raise puppies for this purpose, does that change the morality of it? Maybe some of you will think so, but I think a lot of you will think not. You could also ask this question of other humans. If we started to raise and breed certain humans for a certain purpose, does that have moral implications? Does that mean we are justified in doing it to them, treating them in this way? You might think it does not. Okay, what about feeling closer to them? Well, you might think that morality is just a function of our feelings, in the sense that, whether an action is right or wrong is a function of how we feel about that action. Maybe how we would feel about it if we were sort of free of biases, that sort of thing. So if you feel like this is a morally relevant factor, perhaps it's because you subscribe to a sort of a view like that, a view of morality like that. But notice that we don't typically allow this justification to work for mistreatment of humans, right? So most people would think murdering a total stranger is morally on par with murdering your friend, even if you feel closer to your friend, right? That wouldn't justify, giving more consideration to their rights over the rights of a stranger. So you might think, if this justification doesn't work for humans, why should it work for non-human animals? Furthermore, if our feelings of closeness to various things just were totally inverted or shifted dramatically, would that dramatically change the morality of treating them a certain way? You might think that it wouldn't, in which case perhaps it seems like it's not morally relevant. Furthermore, both of these things, we raise dogs as companions, we feel closer to them, those aren't universally true. There are people who raise dogs for other reasons. There are people who raise other animals, cows, pigs, and chickens as companions. There are people who feel closer to those animals than dogs. So you might worry that even if you thought these were to be morally relevant, these claims aren't universally true. Okay, what about the second one? Perhaps dogs are more intelligent, emotional, etc. So first of all, this is an empirical claim. It's not something we can address or settle from the armchair. I'm certainly not qualified to comment on it myself. I'll just say that I'm pretty skeptical of this claim. I think there are many people who would dispute it, who would claim that at least cows and pigs are as intelligent, emotional, etc. as dogs. Furthermore, even if we grant this assumption, again, we don't typically allow this justification to work in other cases, right? If there's a human who is much less intelligent than other humans, we don't typically let that be a good justification for treating them worse. Furthermore, if there's a certain class of humans who are lower turn out to be lower in intelligence for whatever reason, most of us wouldn't take that to be a good justification to treat them differently. So you might think, even if this assumption were true, it's not clear that it's a morally relevant fact. Okay, so after all that, after getting into various ways of resisting this objection, either by denying the assumptions or denying that they're morally relevant, I think it's worth simply sidestepping this entire issue by revising the argument to get around it. Okay? So that brings us to argument E. Premise 1, if it's wrong to purchase cow, pig, or chicken body parts, which require some cruelty to procure for a home art gallery, then it's wrong to purchase factory-farmed animal products. Premise 2, it's wrong to purchase cow, pig, or chicken body parts, which require some cruelty to procure for a home art gallery. Conclusion, so it's wrong to purchase factory-farmed animal products. All right, now in swapping from puppies to cows, pigs, or chickens, it's possible that I've lost some people on the second premise, right? Maybe some, very strong dog lovers out there no longer find this premise plausible, but I do expect many of you to still find this plausible, even now that we're doing it to cows, pigs, or chickens rather than puppies. Okay, so now we've avoided all of the tricky issues involved in the objection that we just considered. Now we have the same animals involved. Okay, so here is another objection. Now I take this objection to maybe be the most compelling objection we've looked at so far and that we will look at. And it goes something like this. The former is guaranteed to make a difference to the amount of suffering that occurs, whereas the latter may not. Right? It may be unlikely that your individual purchases will affect demand in a large industry such as factory farming. Okay, so we're imagining that this weird farm animal art is taking place in our own world, where that's a very uncommon practice. So if you are trying to acquire these farm animal body parts, you're going to have to go out and pay a specialist who's then going to who's going to have to go out and raise some animals to procure these body parts for you. So when you're purchasing these body parts, you are inevitably increasing the amount of animal suffering that takes place, right? Whereas the factory farming industry is so large that as an individual, your purchases, or perhaps even your purchases over your life, may not actually affect demand, right? There could be a certain threshold such that only when you have a purchase pushing it over the threshold, is that when companies have to go out and raise more animals and inflict more cruelty on animals. And it might be super unlikely that for any one of us, our individual purchases are going to push it over that threshold. So you might think, look, it's super unlikely that your action is actually going to increase the amount of suffering that's taking place. Okay, so I'm going to say a couple of things regarding this objection. First, we don't typically allow this justification for other things, right? So there are many people who think it's wrong to vote, and they think that even though it's unlikely that your individual vote is going to make a difference. Similarly, most people, or many people, would say it's wrong to pollute, even if your own individual contribution to pollution won't make much of a difference. And you might be able to find lots of other cases like that, where we generally find something wrong, even though doing that doesn't increase the total amount of badness in the world. That's the first thing. Now here's the second thing. Even if you are concerned primarily when it comes to morality with the outcomes, right, or with outcomes, you don't just want to consider the outcomes of the value of the probable outcomes, or what's likely to occur. You want to take into account the value of all possible outcomes and their chances of occurring. All right? In other words, when you're evaluating actions, it seems to make most sense to look at the action's expectation value or expected value, which you get by taking all possible outcomes that can occur as a result of the action, and you take the value of each outcome, you multiply it by the probability of that outcome occurring, and then you sum these. And that gives you the expectation value of the action. So just to give you an example, suppose your friend offers you the following bet, right? You're going to roll a die, and if you roll a 1, your friend is going to give you $1 million, right? But if you roll anything else, a 2 through a 6, you're going to give your friend $10. Now, it's very unlikely that you're going to win the $1 million, right? It's unlikely you're going to roll the 1. It's much more likely that you're going to lose and end up having to pay your friend $10. But this is still a really, really good bet to make, right? And you definitely want to make this bet. This bet has an extremely high expectation value. And that's because 1 million times 1/6 plus -10 times 5/6 is still a very, very high amount, right? It still has a very high value. So insofar as you think it makes sense to evaluate actions this way, you want to take into account not just the value of the likely outcome, but the value of all possible outcomes and the probability that each occurs. Okay, so the point of all of this is that the mere fact that your action, right, abstaining from purchasing factory farming, is unlikely to make a difference, right? It's unlikely to be that purchase that pushes it over the threshold that increases demand. That doesn't itself entail that there's no value in the action. What you also have to consider is if the unlikely event were to occur, if your action were to make the difference, what would the value of that outcome be, right? So just, again, by analogy, philosopher Derek Parfit made this point when it comes to the ethics of voting, right? It's very unlikely that your individual vote will make a difference, but that's not enough to determine that there's no value in voting. You also have to think about, if your action were to make a difference, what benefit would there be? And if that benefit is large enough, it can make up for the fact that the chance of it occurring is super small, right? So if you think one candidate is far superior to the other candidates, such that there will be a significant benefit to the average person, and then if you also think about the fact that there are, at least in the US, over 300 million people, that benefit might be super large. So even a very, very small chance of achieving that benefit, if the benefit is large enough, that can give the action a reasonably high expectation value. So thinking back to factory farming, purchasing factory farmed animal products, even if it's super unlikely, again, that your action makes a difference, if it were to make a difference, the benefit might be great enough to outweigh that fact, right? So I think the number is something like there are roughly 10 billion animals raised in factory farms each year. So if your action were to make a difference, however unlikely that is, right? If abstaining from purchasing factory farmed animal products would prevent the purchases from going over the threshold, which would increase demand by however much, and which would increase the amount of animal suffering that takes place, your action may still have value, right? So from the fact that it's very unlikely to have the good effect, from that itself, it doesn't follow that there's no value in the action. You have to also think about how good the outcome would be if you did happen to make a difference. Okay, now here's the third and final thing I'll say in response to this objection. Even if you do subscribe to a moral framework that places outcomes of the utmost, with the utmost moral importance, in other words, outcomes are the thing that matters most when it comes to morality, you might think that the wrongness of an action is not only a function of the value of the outcome of that action alone, but also a function of the value of the outcome of promoting certain rules. In other words, promoting the rule that it's wrong to do that. Some of you might find this plausible, some of you might not, but consider the fact that even if your own individual purchases may not make a difference, morality is not a private matter. You're presumably going to be sharing your moral code with other people, discussing and debating moral claims, trying to establish a shared moral code in your community. And so you may move people over to your line of thinking, into thinking that it's wrong to purchase factory farmed animal products. And they may convince a handful of people. So there's no telling, the benefits of not only acting according to certain rules, but also promoting those rules in your moral community. Okay? Now, someone might respond, well, doesn't that at most have implications for the morality of promoting the rules, right, for advocating for veganism as opposed to for actually being a vegan itself? Now, it's possible that, you could be a pretty good activist for veganism or advocate for veganism pretty well without actually being one yourself or while still purchasing factory farmed animal products. But just given human psychology, you might find that there's some sort of tension that makes it difficult to maintain that sort of position, to successfully and persuasively advocate for a certain sort of action that you don't actually take yourself. Okay, so I've said a lot in response to that objection. Again, I think this objection is probably the most compelling objection that we've looked at and that we will look at, but it's not obvious that it succeeds. However, I'm going to revise the argument one final time just to get around this objection. Okay, so this brings us to the final version of the argument, argument F. Premise 1, if it's wrong to purchase cow, pig, or chicken body parts, which require some cruelty to procure for a home art gallery, even in a world in which this is a common practice involving a large industry, then it's wrong to purchase factory farmed animal products. Premise 2, it's wrong to purchase cow, pig, or chicken body parts, which require some cruelty to procure for a home art gallery, even in a world in which this is a common practice involving a large industry. Conclusion, so it's wrong to purchase factory farmed animal products. Okay, so in this final version, the first premise now avoids the previous objection. Now we have roughly the same chance of your individual purchase affecting demand. Okay, now are there any other ways someone could challenge this first premise? Well, it might be tempting to go back to something about necessity or need, right? Again, you don't need art, but you do need to eat. But again, the response is just, given empirical assumption V, you don't need to eat that, right? You don't need to purchase factory farmed animal products for a healthy, affordable diet. You do need to eat something, but you don't need to eat that, right? Furthermore, it might actually be true that in some sense you do need art or some other form of recreation in your life, at least to maintain good mental health. And so there might not even be that difference between the two cases. Okay. Now, someone might also be tempted to make an objection based on appeal to sort of culture. In other words, the foods that we get through factory farming are embedded deeply in certain cultures. But we can imagine that this sort of art in this world is also deeply embedded in certain cultures. And we might think that doesn't make a moral difference. Furthermore, if you make that objection, you run the risk of putting yourself in a position where you're unable to criticize anything that's deeply embedded in a culture. And you might think it is possible to criticize such things. Okay, so I'm inclined to say that the first premise now is very plausible. Okay, we've tweaked the argument several times in order to make sure our two actions are similar in morally relevant respects, and I'm inclined to think that this premise, F1, is now true. We found two actions that are similar in morally relevant respects, and there aren't any respects in which they're different that are morally relevant. It would seem, to me at least, to be quite arbitrary to say, yes, it's wrong to purchase cow, pig, or chicken body parts, which require some cruelty to procure for a home art gallery, even in a world in which this is common practice, etc. But it's not wrong to purchase factory farmed animal products. So I'm inclined to think this first premise now is plausible. So the question is the second premise still plausible? Right? Does it seem plausible to you that it's wrong to purchase cow, pig, or chicken body parts, which require some cruelty to procure for a home art gallery, even in a world in which this is a common practice involving a large industry? Now, if I think about this claim clearly, I'm inclined to say that this is plausible. Right? I do find it to be intuitively wrong. Okay? And so I do think this argument succeeds in justifying this conclusion, since it's a valid argument, right? The premises entail the conclusion, and both premises are highly plausible. But if you disagree, if you think you can resist the first premise or the second without being arbitrary, then I wish you good fortune in the culture wars to come. And now it begins.